It's a date that France's president had long circled on his calendar. Emmanuel Macron in Dakar this Friday to co-host with Senegal's president Macky Sall a global partnership for education financing conference. Public spending for education in the developing world no longer keeping pace with a growing population, it seems. And if developed nations want to solve the migrant crisis, the likes of which Macron recognizes the urgency of the matter, we're going to see why keeping boys and especially girls in school is key. If all the girls in the world who don't go to school were a country, they would be the world's 10th most populous nation. We're going to be asking what it takes to keep young people in school in the developing world, and whether France in particular has the right ideas when it comes to learning. Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at Africa's education challenges, the developing world's education challenges as well. With us, Mae Kordjian, policy and advocacy officer for the One Campaign. It's important to explain what the One Campaign is. This is a charity that's born from those Millennium Goals in the late 90s.
Yeah, exactly. We are an international campaigning and advocacy organization. We are 9 members strong, and our aim is to eradicate extreme poverty in Africa and preventable diseases. And we basically do awareness raising among the public, and we also try to put pressure on world leaders and decision makers to make sure that the right measures are taken to end extreme poverty.
All right, we're gonna get back to the issue of how those pressures are going. We're also pleased to welcome Priya Joshi, researcher at the Global Education Monitoring Report at the UN's Education Branch, UNESCO. Thank you for being with us. A lot of the data that we've been looking at comes thanks to the work of your group in figuring out how many people need to be in school and are in school or are not in school. And we'll be asking whether the glass is half full or half empty at this point in time. We're also pleased to welcome from Washington, Katie Malouf-Boos, policy advisor on education and health for Oxfam International. Thank you for joining us in the France 24 debate.
Thanks for having me.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, the hashtag F24debate. Well, let's start with the good news. According to the UN's report there that your team puts out, the number of illiterate children is steadily decreasing. This, as the world population grows, you see the numbers there from 2000 to 2015, and it's broken down according to boys and girls on that chart. It's no given, though, that the trend will continue, Priya Joshi, without a push, it seems, because just because it's been going down, the number of illiterate children, that doesn't mean it'll continue to go down, does it? How does it look?
Yes, it is exactly, you're exactly right. The issue is actually the hardest to reach, to require a lot more effort. And, this is an agenda that's been around since 2000, what was called the Education for All agenda. And the closer we reach the goal of, eliminating people out of school, the harder it is to reach the most disadvantaged, the poorest girls, the poorest boys. And it requires a lot more effort. They are challenged by poverty, by location. Rural children are more disadvantaged. And so we just need to keep working at it. And Sub-Saharan Africa is a region that has a very high fertility rate. And, projections indicate that, child age population-wise, that will be the area where a lot of the out-of-school population will also be concentrated. So there are no guarantees, but we are all working towards that effort. My team, our work focuses on monitoring education progress, which includes both, understanding what's happening in terms of who's learning, who's in school, but also, what is happening on the finance end, which is why, this conference is such an important event.
Let's talk about the finance end of things. Mae Kordjian, if I'm not mistaken, your organization flagging the fact that public spending for education went up after those Millennium Goals, but since 2010, they've stalled or they've even gone down. Is that true?
Yeah, it's true. It's a big paradox that we're witnessing because on the one hand, you have global overseas development assistance that is increasing, and it has been doing so for the past 15 years. But on the other hand, the share of aid allocated to education within this part is decreasing, as you said. Since 2022, it went from 13%
Sorry,
to 10%.
since what year?
2002.
2002.
Yeah. It went from 13% to 10% only.
Why?
Well, that's a very good question. I think it's a complete paradox because we see the needs are rising. We see, as you said, that, there's still big challenges. Today, 130 million girls are still out of school and 500 million women still can't read or write. And that's a big challenge. And the most interesting part is that we know that this challenge is not going to go away because we know that the African population is going to double by 2050, which means that we're going to get, an even bigger young population. Mm-hmm. This young population will need access to education in order then to enter the workforce. And today, we are lacking the right financing to get to this goal, clearly.
Katie Malouf-Bous, do you have an explanation as to why public spending on education is going down in the developing world?
Well, and I think that unfortunately donor countries have been reducing their aid for education, although we really hope to see French President Macron and many other world leaders commit robust commitments to the Global Partnership for Education tomorrow in Dakar. But many developing countries are actually committing more and more financing for education. Oxfam has a new commitment to reducing inequality index that looks at countries' performance in terms of policies and spending that they're doing to to reduce inequality. Education is a key part of that, and we're seeing that many countries are actually meeting the global targets that we've set out for spending on education, which is 20% of budgets is the gold standard. So we see countries across the world that are managing to spend this money from their domestic resources, but donors really need to do a lot more to step up and support them.
But do you agree with that, Priya Joshi, that the onus is on donors?
Well, the onus is on everyone. Of course, we are under a shared agenda.
Because a lot of these countries, they just don't spend much on education, or if they do, the money's misappropriated.
That is not really true. If we look at the African region, they spend, as countries, they spend more than any other region. So 17% of their budgets actually go to education fund spending. In 2015, we developed a costing analysis, and we predicted that the financing gap, which is how much even if the countries really spend as much as they could, they still had about a $39 billion financing gap that should be accommodated through funding from donor countries. So I think it's this agenda, which is global. It's an international recognition that we need everyone to have primary and secondary education. Because we've been where we have the mandate to monitor education progress, we are in the business of tracking how education can literally both transform, save lives. When they're educated,
right.
Mothers, children survive. But there's also a lot of not quantifiable statistics. Not as many people know about how education can improve, peace and tolerance. How education can help how we think about the environment. So besides all of the quantifiable things that we do, there's a lot of non-quantifiable things that are also going on. And I feel like to answer your question on why is this not happening, why isn't the onus on education, and why is funding going somewhere else? Part of the issue often is that there's not as much focus on prevention. Let's say if you can think of education as prevention for future issues.
Right.
If there's a refugee crisis, the question is let's act now on this specific issue. Let's provide. There's always the immediate challenge of water, sanitation, food. So
education tends to come second.
There's not as much attention on the fact of how important education can be. In all of these goals, which is something that we've worked on quite extensively as well.
Well, certainly this Dakar summit will be putting the spotlight on it. And by the way, when Emmanuel Macron lands in Senegal, he'll be greeted by a teachers' strike. University professors in Senegal want better pay and working conditions. There seems to be a wave of public sector strikes in West Africa these days that involve, in some cases, teachers in places like Togo, but also Chad.
The government is responsible for the future of the children. To govern is to provide, but they have not provided for anything. It is the poor that are paying for it, and they know that those who are paying are still here.
At this point in time, let's welcome a fourth guest. From Brussels, Yena Belekiani, the founder of Congo Girls United. Welcome to the France 24 debate. Your thoughts on Emmanuel Macron landing in Senegal and being greeted by a teacher's strike?
Thank you. I think they probably do have a reason for such a strike. Teachers are underpaid. They're not really taken care of. And if you think about it, if the teachers are not being giving the resources they need, then they're not exactly being equipped to teach our children. So I think the teachers are just looking for a fair perspective on their part, you know.
Looking for a fair perspective, Yena, your organization, Congo Girls United, when you see that the educational challenges in places like Congo at this point in time, would you say, when you think back to when there was those millennial goals of 2 decades ago to wipe out the debt from countries in the developing world, 20 years on, how are things? Is more money there for education?
Things are not. Yeah, and I think it's a lack of the donors not really investing in education. And like someone else, I think, touched on this, is that people are not really looking at the prevention side of what education could provide, you know. And Congo Girls United, I'm speaking on a woman's perspective, is that we are leaving a large population behind when it comes to educating our populations. And it's really concerning at a large, you know, at a larger view. It's really concerning that a lot of girls, you know, a lot of girl children are not getting educated, and so part of that is actually contributing to a lot of the issues that societies are facing.
So
a lot of the goals of moving beyond debt and actually a more equitable.
Sorry, let me bring in Kurkugi-chan on this. French president, when he was back at the UN in September, and then at that African Union EU summit that took place in Ivory Coast late last year, in both cases, he presented this as a trade-off. We don't want a migrant crisis here in Europe, so let's offer people better perspectives in the developing world, basically for them not all to come in an unruly fashion to our shores. It's not exactly how he put it, but it's certainly how a lot of people interpreted it. Is that the right calculation to make?
I don't think that should be at the center of the debate. I think the fact that education is a basic human right should be at the debate. I think that the fact that some girls are still not able to go to school, that's the main problem today.
But it's not the way it's sold, especially when we see, for instance, Angela Merkel has made several trips to sub-Saharan Africa. It's with a view towards her own electorate back home, is it not?
I think that when Emmanuel Macron puts education, you know, as the priority of his foreign policies, especially in terms of development, he's also aware that education is not only about putting girls into school, but education has like impacts on a lot of different other sectors. You know, it's about empowering women, it's about giving better prosperity, it's also about bringing stability and security. It also has positive impact on health. there's, education has like impacts on a lot of different sectors, and it is the most powerful weapon that we have today to fight extreme poverty. And I think that he's aware of that, and that's, he's also thinking about this in his speech.
Has the migrant crisis served as an advertisement for what you're trying to achieve?
I mean, that's not for me to say. That's definitely not the message that we've been trying to convey. We are focusing on like human rights, the fact that everybody should get an education. And yeah, I think the migration crisis has brought a lot of security issues. I don't think that it has had an impact on the education field that much.
Priya Joshi, has there been renewed interest in your field since the migrant crisis?
Indeed, there has been a focus on the migrant crisis itself. So there has been, funding-wise now, if you go back to financing, there is, besides GPE, there's also an Education Cannot Wait Fund, which is going to target education in emergency situations. And, it has its own sort of emphasis on trying to both prevent and, deal with emergency situations. It is true that... it's more this issue of let's not keep the issue just to that specific issue. We need. But
do you think Emmanuel Macron would be in Dakar if there hadn't been a migrant crisis?
I mean, this is not for me to answer at all, given that I can only speak from the position of an international organization and monitoring progress. All I can say is that we, in our team, we are actually going to be focusing on issues of migration, displacement, and education coming on. So clearly there is interest. But I think one of the things to realize is that migration is a historical process. It's been going on forever. One of our themes is that it isn't just about what is happening currently. It is, let's figure it out more broadly, holistically. Can we think about how education and migration work, to as systemically. So it's not just about, a particular refugee crisis at a certain point in time. It's also about what's happening in China, in India. It's about history. So
and it is about the long term.
Yes.
Educating someone is about the long term. When we come back, we'll be looking at how, in particular, educating girls is so important. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate.
Revisited, presented by Stuart Norval.
Transnistria, a Russian-speaking enclave in Moldova, where Romanian is the official language. A breakaway republic living in the shadow of Moscow. An uncertain future has driven locals away from the separatist province. The international community has not recognized it. The economy is depressed. Censorship is widespread. Transnistria and its capital Tiraspol is increasingly caught between Europe and Russia.
Revisited on France 24 and France24.com. You Are Here, your programme spotlighting French heritage.
Versailles, the Louvre, Mont Saint-Michel are well-known stars of French heritage. But French genius and France harbours many other hidden treasures. The arts, gastronomy, architecture, as well as nature's wonders. Come along with France 24, discover France's living heritage. From young apprentices to accomplished craftsmen and farmers, to Michelin star sporting chefs. Meet these people whose passion for their professions preserve and drive French heritage.
You Are Here on France 24 and France24.com.
Welcome back. Before we resume the France 24 debate, some of the stories that Laura Cillier is watching for you in the newsroom. The Court of Arbitration for Sport throws out lifetime doping bans for 28 Russian athletes, leaving open the possibility they could compete in the upcoming Winter Olympics in Pyeongchang. Worldwide condemnation as Poland's Senate sends to the president's desk a bill that punishes by up to 3 years in prison anyone who refers to Nazi death camps as Polish death camps. The White House expected to release a congressional Republican memo that's critical of the FBI's handling of the Russia hacking investigation. This despite the Bureau's warning that the memo is inaccurate and incomplete. And Facebook sued for censorship. A French civil court hearing the complaint of a teacher whose account was suspended over a photo of Gustave Courbet's 19th century nude painting, The Origin of the World. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're looking at the challenges facing education in the developing world, in particular in Africa. This as donors get set to meet to talk about public financing for education in Dakar. With us to talk about it, about the challenges facing them, is Mae Kourichan, Policy and Advocacy Officer for the charity The One Campaign. Also with us, Priya Joshi, researcher at the Global Education Monitoring Report of the UN's education body, UNESCO, which is headquartered here in Paris. From Brussels, Yena Belekiani, founder of Congo Girls United. And from Washington, Katie Malouf-Bous, policy advisor on education and health for Oxfam International. 9 out of 10 out of the bottom 10 countries for girls' education, by the way, are in Africa. The only outlier on the list, compiled by your organization, Mae, is Afghanistan. That's got activists speaking out in places like the Senegalese city of Pekin.
In a family where there are boys and girls, the parents would rather take the boys to school and say, girls, you end up being in the kitchen, being wives and all that. There is this limitation. So girls grow up with that mindset and they stick to it. So most girls, even when having the opportunities, they don't want to really go far because their belief is at the end of the day, I will end up just being somebody's wife.
Yena Belekiani, explain to us why it is so key to keep girls in school.
Well, I think it's really important to keep our girls in school because getting an education isn't just about getting an education. It's a wonderful opportunity to explore your mind. It's a wonderful opportunity to actually reach for new heights. And getting an education provides you the security in the future that you may not have if you don't get education. So it's really important that girls have this sense of wanting to get an education. And then most importantly, not just that, getting an education provides a foundation for girls to be able to move socially, So that is why it's really important to get an education. I was born in the Congo. And I am highly educated, but the difference is that I had a chance to get educated in a country like the United States. Other girls don't have that chance. And they're stuck in this systematic loop of, you go to school and then it's 6th grade, you can't go to school anymore. It's either parents can't afford to go to school or there are cultural barriers keeping these girls from going to school. And like you heard, it's a whole debate of why should I go to school? I'm going to go to school anyway, end up being someone's wife, and then not be able to do anything. So, in all, getting an education, it's a getaway. It's a getaway to a better life. It's a getaway to better opportunities that are not otherwise afforded if you are not given the choice to go to school.
Katie Malouf-Bous, how do you keep girls in school? What needs to be done?
Well, and one of the extra dimensions to this problem of girls being excluded from school is the inequality issue, which means that the poorest girls are actually disproportionately excluded from school. So, for example, the World Bank recently calculated that only 25% of the poorest girls in low-income countries will complete primary school. And one of the important things that we have to realize is that girls can be just excluded from school because of school fees and other financial barriers to access. Their parents have to make really tough choices sometimes when poor families have to pay money for their children to go to school, whether it be in a public or a private school. Sometimes boys are sent first. And so actually we saw quite a lot of progress in girls' education in Africa over the last 15, 20 years as a wave of countries implemented school fee abolition policies. So many more girls have come into school because of that. However, many countries are also rolling back these policies or allowing schools to charge informal fees. There's also processes of privatization of education that are happening, particularly in Africa, where for-profit, low-fee private schools are taking advantage of the gaps in access to quality education. And children are then needing to pay fees, and girls are then disproportionately excluded.
Yeah, let me ask you about that point, Katie, because that's an important one. I saw a report that by the year 2021, more than a quarter of those in school in Africa will be in the private education system. Why is that such a factor of inequality?
Well, and this is a really tragic function of government's failure to invest adequately in quality public education. I mean, education takes investment. A lot of people say, oh, we can be innovative, we can add technology, we can do all these things that will save money. Those may be true above a certain level of investment, but many African countries are spending very, very low levels of investment. UNESCO, for example, recently calculated that the average low-income country is spending only $70 per pupil on education, whereas the minimum that they calculated necessary is about $200 per pupil to get to a quality education. So you can see there's a big gap there in terms of what needs to be invested. Money isn't the only thing that we need, but without adequate financing, we really can't get to quality education. And then children are forced to go elsewhere into the private sector, where often they're not also receiving a quality education. Many of these for-profit schools are, taking advantage of families and the perceptions of private education and not actually offering an education of good quality.
Your thoughts on this, because we have had May John in the past years complaints about some of these private education initiatives that were backed by Western charities and that turned out to be duds.
Yeah, I completely agree with what has just been said. I think this is just an illustration of the lack of financing from the public sector. And this is both, because of donor country lack of financing, but also low-income countries' government lack of financing. I think, the burden should be shared between the two. And you have to understand that private school won't reach girls and boys in the most remote areas and the poorest ones, because they will never be able to afford it. So the only way to achieve universal education by 2030 is to make sure that we have a strong, free public sector when it comes to education policies. That's a must.
Let me get your reaction, Priya, to something that we just heard from Katie Maluf-Boussa a moment ago. You were saying in part one of our discussion that Africans, as a percentage of their total budget, spend more than other continents on education. She was saying, yes, but when you calculate it per pupil, yes, it's not enough.
Well, these are consistent statements, I would say. It actually links back to they are doing as much as the first thing I said. I think that they're doing as much as possible given existing budgets and GDPs, and it is the reason that there needs to be an international community that supports and enables governments to fulfill their responsibility to make sure that all children and all adults really have the right to education, throughout life. Yes, I don't think these are inconsistent issues.
But you heard Katie.
Because one is about the level, and one is about, one is about the.
I definitely heard Katie say though that these governments need to raise their game when it comes to spending more on it.
Well, they are. They have been as I said, we monitor this. They have been improving how much they spend. Currently, we are trying to focus also, but we see that the aid situation has been quite problematic. It's fallen for 6 years in a row. It went from 10% in 2009 to 6.9% in 2015. So despite the fact that all of this evidence is building on all of the ways education transforms lives, the financial situation from the donor community is not enough. Like we said, all of us, I think, agree that it is not just the donor community's responsibility, and it never has been. But a lot of the donor community does not even meet the 0.7% of GNI that they would, that they should give to aid. That was the sort of consensus. And actually, when we calculate these numbers, if they give 0.7% to aid, and if 10% goes to education, then the financing gap I mentioned earlier, the 39 billion financing gap, would not exist. And 6 of the 29 countries actually do give 0.7% to aid, so it's not that unrealistic either. So,
and France's president has committed to do so by 2022, but he's not there yet, is he? I've read a lot of criticism of France on that score.
Well, let's just focus on the optimism at this moment.
don't want to get you in hot water with your bosses there. The French president, let's talk about it, because on the Tunisian leg of his 6th trip to Africa as president, Emmanuel Macron touting partnerships on education, job training. He was in the company of French internet mogul Xavier Niel in his delegation, and encouraging innovation.
We wish to announce today the creation of a €50 million fund to help the development of initiatives by young Tunisian entrepreneurs. This will allow to concretely assist young people who have projects, whatever the sector or the level of qualifications, to fight joblessness, especially with regards to the youngest people and qualified youth.
On that score, let me ask you, Yenna Belikiani in Brussels, the French president, as the co-chair of this summit in Africa, is for education, which he's hammered, after hammering home the point when he was at the United Nations back in September. Is it purely for development, for altruism, or does that raise eyebrows that here's France wielding influence?
Well, I'm not one to say much, but I hope it's not just for altruism. I hope it's for actually the aid, as we've all agreed here. Of course, the countries who do receive this aid, they're also partially responsible. But if he's really talking about investing in education in these developed countries, then I'm hoping that he's actually willing to do that,
I sense a bit of
That's my hope. I'm not much to comment. I don't have much to comment on it right now, but I hope that. I mean, there's always skepticism sometimes when it comes to these things, because you're not really sure what's at play here. Is it politics? What is it? But I hope that actions in the future will reveal themselves, and that he is actually going to put actions behind what he's actually saying or proposing at the moment.
Let me get into domestic politics, So my
skepticism is reserved for now.
Is cautious. Kolgi-chan, let me ask you, because here in France, we're just at the outset of an education reform. The latest in a long line of education reforms. Mm-hmm. And, there's one of the big criticisms leveled against the French education system is that the curriculum is out of touch with the needs of today's job market. Mm-hmm. Did you raise an eyebrow when you see the French president co-chairing this summit?
I think what the French reform shows is that the quality of education is an endless challenge, and that every country is facing it. Let's be honest, in Europe we have very different system of education and very different policies. I think Emmanuel Macron co-chairing this partnership is a very strong signal that he's actually willing to take this to take the leadership on this issue at the global stage. And the first thing that needs to be done, especially in Africa, is allowing girls especially to have access to education. And then obviously there's a lot of policy reforms and discussion and debate that can go on, as what is happening in France, about the best quality possible. But the first thing we need to do is ensure that every girl can go to school in Africa. And the fact that France is stepping up and leading this issue is a good thing. Now, he's been elected for 8 months, and tomorrow is crucial because, it's time to walk the talk, and tomorrow is kind of a test for him. Because France hasn't actually announced its contribution to the Global Partnership for Education yet. It will do so tomorrow, hopefully. And, he needs to lead by example. France needs to be among the top donors to GPE, and the entire success of the conference depends on it. So all eyes will be on Emmanuel Macron tomorrow, I guess.
You sound like you're expecting to make some big announcement when it comes to money pledges, but we'll see about that. Let me just go back to you on this one, Yena Belikiani, because Congo, it's former French. Well, I don't know which Congo you're from, but former French and Belgian colonies, the two of them. When you look at oftentimes in these former French colonies, the curriculum is inspired by the curriculum here in France. Do you think that the curriculum that you have in sub-Saharan nations is the appropriate one for the education that children need in those countries?
I think on that front that the education is not really appropriate. It reflects more on the colonial background of education that was already present. It doesn't really focus much on the country's education, the history, the arts of that country. So it's a complex issue to navigate, but I do believe that right now it is not an appropriate perspective or approach to education, actually, particularly in the sub-Saharan Africa. Like in the Congo right now, the education is very, it's not up to date, as I would say.
It's out of date. Katie Malouf-Bous, you agree?
It needs a lot of, it needs more, it's out of date. Yeah.
Katie Malouf-Bous, you agree?
Well, I think the key issue here is that countries should be defining their own curriculums and looking at the issues and the subject matter that is most important to them in their own national development. And that's really one of the core elements of a quality education. And education also goes beyond sort of just providing a livelihood. It's also about encouraging people to be active citizens and members of their society and to fight for a more equal and just society and to preserve their cultural heritage. And so I think it's right that each country really define for itself the curriculum that's appropriate. And so I think that the other thing that's really needed is investment in teachers to be able to really bring to life a curriculum that can meet the challenges of the 21st century in terms of the technological change that's happening. We need teachers that are well supported, that are paid a living wage, that are equipped with the technology that they may need to expose children and young adults to the world out there. And that, again, requires the investment that we so desperately need. And that's why we think it's so important that donors are investing in the Global Partnership for Education, which, as you mentioned, is having its big pledging conference tomorrow, because we think that it is one of the most effective ways to get money and resources and support to country-owned education plans, and support those countries who are both most in need and who are also prioritizing education in their own budgets.
Priya Joshi, on that score, on Friday, France 24 will be airing in its Focus segment a report showing how in Senegal, where this conference is happening, since 2012, they've done a retraining in a lot of cases of teachers. They've really taken it from scratch because, well, a country like Senegal, they realized oftentimes the teachers weren't qualified. Mm-hmm. And also when the education is lacking, the alternative for some parents is to put their kids in Quranic schools.
Yes, I mean, I think it's very important to think about quality education in as broad a manner as we can, and we do that in our thinking. It is about having trained teachers. It's about having a gender-sensitive curricula. It's about an enabling environment where women can feel safe, that there's adequate sanitation facilities. It's about, the so many millions of children, especially in Africa, cannot read because of the medium of instruction issue. The fact that, there's so many languages,
What does UNESCO say on that score?
We just need to provide textbooks are very important. We need to be able to provide. It's a very cost-effective input, and it should be provided.
Is it better? Is it better to teach in a local language, and that way you learn,
Yes,
or
yes.
or do you say, hey, you've got to learn whatever the national language is?
There is research that basically says in earlier years, it's the best if you learn in your mother tongue. And, over time you can transition to national languages or international languages. And it is this issue, I think we go back to this idea of innovation, of privatization, etc. There are things that are core. They are core to both, national ownership. They are core to quality of education that need to be supported strongly. And GPE is doing it with a real strong focus on, African countries and conflict-affected countries. France could, support that effort by focusing more on basic education in their aid. So there are things that are really core at that early age that it really need to be supported a lot more. And, to turn it back to the question of financing, basic education targeting would be really helpful from a donor landscape point of view.
And just to get back to the discussion we were having about the curriculum itself, because as I was saying, here in France, we're at the outset of another education reform, and one of the big arguments is that the curriculum just isn't adapted to 2018. What's it like in the developing world? What do you?
Well, I think it's a struggle globally, actually. The OECD is always talking about all of the developed countries as well.
So where do you put the accent? Do you put the accent more on?
One of the things I would say is, globally, what has been revolutionary since the Millennium Development Goals, as we've transitioned to the Sustainable Development Goals, is Target 4.7 on education is on curriculum. It's about sustainable development and global citizenship. It encompasses a lot of things that people should know. People should be able to, learn about tolerance, about, comprehensive sexuality education. There are a lot of things that people need to know. Globally, actually, it's not just about the developing world. But in terms of a lot of this, it is about financing. It is about, are we equipping, classrooms with the right textbooks? Are we equipping, do we have an enabling environment for teachers so that they're not always going on strikes? All of these things are sort of interwoven in a financing. There's a financing argument to be made because.
And are there positive examples of countries where they've been able to change that curriculum and make it more nation-specific, make it more open to people who come from various cultures? Tough question.
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
But let me throw it in that case back to you, Katie Malouf Bous. Is there an example that's been set on that score of what you were just mentioning of having curriculums that are more adapted to today's world?
Well, I can speak to quality education more broadly, which goes beyond curriculum. But for example, one country that I think is really a success story that others can look at is Vietnam. Vietnam has scored at the same level as Germany on the global education assessments, PISA, recently. And really the analysis shows that Vietnam has invested in high quality but equitable public education. So they've really made a concerted focus on ensuring education is equitable and accessible to all, including the poorest, and that they've really invested in ensuring that quality is shared across the population. And they've seen really impressive improvements in test scores. And so I can't speak to the specific curriculum in that context, but that is an example of a country that's really doing a lot and has seen some impressive results. They've also really put the money up. They've spent nearly 6% of their GDP on education, nearly 20% of their budget, which is right at the gold standard in terms of what the global benchmarks are. And so it really shows that when countries are investing in quality and equity, they can make great progress.
Quality and equitable public education. We're going to have to leave it there. There's so much more to talk about. Katie Malouf Bous, I want to thank you for joining us from Washington. Yena Belakiani in Brussels here in the studio. Mae Kogicyan and Priya Joshi, thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.